He was a Roman emperor, yet longed to be born a flower girl. Rome 218 AD. A 14-year-old boy who had never held a sword, never set foot on a battlefield, was placed upon the imperial throne, not because of military glory, nor because of divine lineage, but because he was the high priest of a foreign sun god from the deserts of Syria. And thus the Roman court, once the cradle of legendary generals like Caesar and Augustus, suddenly became a strange stage where religion, sexuality, and power intertwined in rituals half sacred, half performance, in feasts that never ended, and in whispers of horror echoing beyond the palace gates. In Roman history, few figures have inspired such a mix of fascination and dread as Elagabalus, the teenage emperor who ruled for just 4 years, yet left a permanent scar on the memory of an entire empire. He was deified in life and discarded like garbage into the river in death. Today we enter his story not to judge, but to listen. Because sometimes the truth behind someone called a monster helps us understand ourselves and the fragile lines between identity and power. In just a few minutes, you'll discover why Elagabalus, though cursed by Rome, is hailed by the modern world as a trailblazing symbol of gender and personal freedom. Imagine an early morning in the hills of Syria. The desert wind whispers through the roof of the Emesa temple, where the scent of myrrh clings to the air around a gleaming black stone, sacred as the very heart of the sun god. Kneeling on the warm stone floor before it is a slender boy, his forehead nearly obscured by a gold-encrusted crown. His name, spoken in hushed reverence, is Varius Avitus Bassianus, and neither he nor anyone else knows that within mere months, the entire Roman Empire will bow before a 14-year-old child. It was the year 217. After the bloody assassination of Emperor Caracalla in the eastern frontier, the throne fell into the hands of a man with no royal lineage, Macrinus. He seized power through conspiracy and held onto it by cutting soldiers' bonuses. But in doing so, he became the enemy of the very army that had raised him. Meanwhile, in exile, Julia Maesa, Caracalla's aunt, was silently crafting a move that would reshape history. Maesa had no army, no weapons, but she possessed gold, enormous amounts of it, and something even more powerful, a story. She declared that her grandson was the secret son of Caracalla, the soldier god adored by the people. To breathe life into this tale, she showered the camps of the 3rd Gallic Legion with gold, along with sacred dawn rituals where the boy Bassianus, clad in crimson robes, stood before the black stone of the sun, bathed in morning light and the awe of devout warriors. Then, the unthinkable happened. In the dusty plains near Raffinea, the legions raised their banners and proclaimed the boy who had never seen battle as Imperator Caesar, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, Emperor of Rome. But could it truly work while the legitimate Emperor Macrinus was marching south with his army? History says, yes. The final clash occurred outside the walls of Antioch. Though Macrinus had experience and trained men, he hesitated, rattled by omens, and lost the initiative. Elagabalus, meanwhile, remained in his chariot, not as a commander, but as a prophet. Above him, the sacred symbol of the sun god was raised high, as though the deity himself were overseeing the battle. A sudden strike from Maesa's flank shattered Macrinus's defenses. He fled, was captured, and beheaded. His head, rolling through the Syrian dust, marked the end of a reign that had lasted exactly 14 months. In Rome, the Senate hesitated at first, but it didn't take long to understand the truth. All the Eastern legions had sworn loyalty to the boy, or rather, to the gold, the bloodline, and the myth. And so, the young priest from Emesa was officially declared emperor, though no Roman had yet seen his face. Why then was a 14-year-old boy able to overthrow an emperor and seize the most powerful throne in the ancient world? 3 reasons stand out. First, Macrinus made a fatal mistake. He cut the soldiers' pay, an act no different than handing them over to his enemies. Second, he underestimated the power of mythology. He didn't understand that soldiers need more than orders. They need a symbol to believe in. And third, he dismissed women, failing to realize that while men draft strategies, women can build an empire out of whispers and a few chests of coin. Elagabalus entered Rome in a gilded chariot, but deep inside, he did not merely want to rule. He wanted to be worshipped as a god, and that was when the real trouble began. When Elagabalus entered Rome, the empire did not merely receive a young emperor. It welcomed a god whose name it had never heard before. From afar, the crowds were not in awe, because he was emperor, but because of how he appeared. Standing tall in a golden chariot shimmering under the Italian summer sun, Elagabalus wore no armor, carried no sword. Instead, he was draped in a purple robe embroidered with suns, its golden hem gleaming. A radiant crown adorned with amethyst sat atop his curls. His face bore light makeup, and his gaze did not meet the people's as a ruler's, but as a prophet who had just descended from the sanctuary. A child from the desert, yet within his eyes burned a desire no one foresaw, to turn the throne into an altar and himself into a god. From childhood, Elagabalus had lived amidst the incense and chants of Elagabal, the sun god of Syria, worshipped through ancient rituals and the blood of sacrificed beasts. He was not just a priest, he was the soul of the ceremony. Every step he took in the temple was watched, every motion of his hand was received as a divine decree, and when he was placed on the Roman throne, he saw no reason to relinquish that role. He brought it with him. He wanted the entire empire to kneel as the villagers once had, beneath the stone altar of Emesa. Not long after his coronation, Elagabalus ordered the construction of a new temple on the Palatine Hill, named the Elagabalium, dedicated to the Eastern sun god, right in the heart of Rome's traditional religious sanctuaries. But it wasn't the temple itself that stunned the Romans. It was how it was consecrated. The sacred black stone, believed to be a meteorite symbolizing Elagabal, was placed upon a ceremonial cart. It was not drawn by horses, but by senators. They, representatives of the Roman state, were forced to kneel and drag the stone like beasts in a funeral procession. Behind them, Elagabalus followed, chanting ancient Syrian hymns in a lilting voice, his face powdered, golden dust sparkling on his eyelids like the sun itself. Rome fell silent. The Romans were no strangers to foreign gods. They had once worshipped deities from Egypt, Persia, Gaul, but never had a god entered Rome this way, by force, by spectacle, and with such suspicious grandeur. And never before had an emperor declared himself to be that god. Elagabalus made no attempt to hide it. He declared himself the living embodiment of the sun god, the bridge between mortals and the divine, the only one who could offer, speak, and intercede on behalf of the empire. During rituals, he wore silk dresses, pearl necklaces, a crown like that of a goddess of love, and walked on small, trained feet, tiptoeing like a temple dancer. Once during a great 3-day night festival, Elagabalus ascended the Elagabalium, laurel wreath in hand, standing tall under the crimson fire of 3,000 torches. He gazed directly at the crowd and smiled as if heaven itself were speaking through him. Then he whispered, "You do not worship the stone. You worship me." Below the hill, generals bowed, citizens bowed. Even dissenters could do nothing, because opposing him was no longer defiance of an emperor, but of a deity. And in Rome, that meant death. But true belief cannot be forced. And in the hearts of Romans, the blind faith Elagabalus demanded was nothing more than theater. Beautiful, even enchanting, but no one truly believed. They laughed with him, danced with him, knelt during rituals, then whispered behind his back, calling him the mad boy in a dress. Religion to Elagabalus was no longer a system of faith. It became a stage, and he was its playwright, its lead actor, and the god at its center, sculpted for the spotlight. But there is one truth that not even a self-made deity can deny. Every empire, no matter how patient, has its limits. And Elagabalus, blinded by his divine fantasies, had begun crossing the lines Rome never forgave, turning rites into theatrical parades, transforming the emperor into a courtesan in golden silk, and turning a disciplined empire into a vanity pageant of one man's ego. And this was only the beginning. No one could pinpoint exactly when things began to unravel. It was just clear that after the sacred rituals, Elagabalus began playing a different game. The game of flesh. At first, they were just whispers, that the emperor frequented public bathhouses not to relax, but to handpick young men, that he had a secret chamber built behind the Elagabalium temple, where candles never went out and moans echoed through the night like twisted prayers. But once the rumors slipped past the marble walls, the truth became unavoidable. Elagabalus wasn't hiding anything. He flaunted it. He wanted to be seen. During banquets, he would summon nude male dancers, bodies slicked with perfumed oil, to sit on the laps of senators and feed them grapes from his own mouth. While the elder statesman stiffened in silent horror, Elagabalus would giggle. Isn't power itself just another kind of pleasure? But it wasn't just about lust. Elagabalus used sexuality as a weapon. his own form of imperial policy. He married, then divorced at least 5 women within 2 years. One of them was a sacred Vestal virgin, an act so sacrilegious it sent shudders through the Roman elite. And yet, it didn't stop there. One day, Elagabalus made an announcement that would go down in history. The empire's first royal husband, a muscular charioteer named Heracles, not in secret, but in full view of the court. Elagabalus called him "my husband" and publicly referred to himself as his wife. Then he begged the Senate to officially recognize their union as a legitimate imperial marriage. The murmurs across the city turned into a storm. Not because Elagabalus loved men, Rome had tolerated such things before, but because he turned his private life into public law. He didn't just want to love, he demanded that Rome celebrate it, ritualize it, obey it. And then came the final blow. Elagabalus began referring to himself as the empress, not emperor. He spoke of his longing to have a womb, to bear children. He even begged physicians to open his body to make that dream possible. The request, bizarre and heart-wrenching, was recorded in the annals of history, not because it was absurd, but because it pierced the Roman soul. Sex was no longer a personal matter. It was now the center of government. Important decisions were delayed for love festivals. State rituals turned into erotic performances. During one of the temple ceremonies, he released hundreds of dove-shaped phalluses made of gold into the sky, mocking even the gods he once served. The public remained silent, the army increasingly uneasy, but it was the Senate, long thought to be spineless, that began to stir. Rome, which had endured war, plague, and famine, was now trembling under the rule of a teenage boy who fancied himself the goddess of desire. Inside the palace, soaked in the scent of myrrh and jasmine, Elagabalus still laughed, still danced, still lived in a world of silk and surrender. But outside, something was shifting. Quietly, surely. A storm was gathering, and this time no one would sing along. No one wanted to kneel anymore. Rome's tolerance had its limits, and Elagabalus, in all his glittering glory, had just crossed it. It began with fabric, silks softer than whispers, embroidered robes of gold thread imported from the east, a touch of cold around the eyes, pearls nestled into carefully curled hair. And then came the transformation, not of body, but of identity. Elagabalus didn't just dress as a woman, he became her. At dawn, the emperor would step into his private quarters and emerge not as the ruler of Rome, but as a high priestess of the sun god, walking with grace, speaking in a softened voice and wearing gowns that shimmered like dawnlight. He wasn't mocking womanhood, he revered it. He lived it with a devotion that felt, to some, like sacred ritual, to others like war. Inside the temple of Elagabalus, the rituals grew stranger by the day. Elagabalus didn't just lead ceremonies, he staged performances. Sometimes he was the bride of the sun, sometimes the goddess of fertility. One week he summoned dozens of prostitutes to kneel beside him, declaring them sisters in divine service. The next he stood before Roman generals in full regalia, whispering that only the feminine could bridge the mortal and the divine. Outside the temple walls, the city buzzed with confusion and unease. An emperor in a dress, they muttered, a man who prays like a woman, rules like a courtesan. But Elagabalus wasn't deterred. He believed Rome needed to change, not just its gods, but its very soul. And so, gender became his theater, power his stage. One night, he ordered the palace guards to stand down. Then he slipped out, alone, in heavy makeup and golden sandals, walking into the alleys of Rome as a common sex worker. He would sit in windows, offer his body to strangers, and return before dawn. Cheeks flushed, lips still painted, laughing like a child who had gotten away with something forbidden. "Don't you see?" he once told a courtier. "Power is performance, and Rome has forgotten how to feel." To him, the imperial crown was not a weight of responsibility, but a mask, a prop in a grand spiritual play. In public, he knelt before sacred stones. In private, he wept over his inability to give birth. He begged his physicians to fix him, to create a womb, to complete what he believed the gods had started. The request was impossible, but the yearning was real. For Elagabalus, gender was not a cage, but a canvas. He painted with the colors of myth, of instinct, of emotion. And in doing so, he shattered every Roman ideal of manhood, of order, of empire. But Rome was not ready. The senators, already outraged by his excess, now saw something worse than sin. They saw chaos. An emperor who didn't know what he was, a priestess who ruled a military empire, a boy who wanted to birth a god. The whispers turned to plans. The laughter faded. And as the curtain rose higher on Elagabalus's divine drama, the knives behind the scenes began to sharpen. In the theater of power, not every performance is applauded. Some end in silence, others in blood. Long before Elagabalus wore the crown, a different kind of ruler had already taken her place behind the throne. Julia Maesa. She didn't command armies. She didn't hold senatorial power. Yet from the shadows of Roman politics, she orchestrated one of the most daring coups the empire had ever seen. It was Maesa, not her grandson, who lit the match that set fire to Rome's imperial order. When her nephew Caracalla was assassinated and her family cast aside, Julia Maesa didn't mourn. She calculated. In exile in Syria, she watched as her grandson, a soft-faced temple boy with an otherworldly charisma, enchanted the priests of the sun god. In his gestures, in his rituals, she saw something the world might follow, or fear. Either would do, and so she made her move. With jewels, gold, and whispered promises, she bribed the eastern legions. This boy, she said, is the son of Caracalla, the rightful heir. It was a lie, but a beautiful one. Soldiers swore loyalty, banners were raised, and within months the temple boy became Caesar. The empire bowed, not to Elagabalus, but to Julia Maesa's ambition. But she wasn't alone. At her side stood Julia Soaemias, the emperor's mother. Unlike Maesa's cold precision, Soaemias ruled with devotion. To her, Elagabalus wasn't just a pawn, he was a prophecy. The two of them, mother and son, walked hand in hand through scandal and sanctity. She helped lead his rituals, dressed in golden robes like him, and whispered blessings while the Senate cursed. They became twin flames of a divine empire. He, the god reborn, she, the mother of the divine. Together, Maesa and Soaemias formed an unholy trinity of matriarchal power. Grandmother, mother, and son turned god. Rome had never seen anything like it. In a world ruled by men, these women didn't ask for power. They took it, but behind the incense and ceremony, something else festered: paranoia. As Elagabalus spiraled deeper into chaos, banquets, orgies, and blasphemies, Julia Maesa began to doubt. She had created an emperor of spectacle, but could he keep an empire? The soldiers whispered, the Senate plotted, the people mocked, and so Maesa did what any ruthless strategist would do. She turned her gaze to another boy, Alexander Severus, Elagabalus's young cousin, quiet, disciplined, adored by the Praetorian Guard. Everything Elagabalus was not. A second plan took root. The same woman who had once crowned her grandson now schemed his replacement. A mother's devotion met a grandmother's cold logic. And in the quiet halls of the palace, the future of the empire shifted once again, one whisper at a time. In the end, Elagabalus was not overthrown by enemies or rebels. He was undone by family, by the very women who had raised him, loved him, and then decided Rome deserved better. Power in Rome never came from the gods. It came from the women who knew how to play them. It began with silence, the kind of silence that weighs heavier than words. When Elagabalus first entered the Senate chamber, not as a student of governance, but as a godchild wrapped in silk, the senators rose, but not out of respect, out of fear. He didn't speak of laws. He spoke of light, of sun gods, of sacred stones. He didn't propose reforms. He asked the senators to dance, yes, dance, before the altar of a foreign deity he alone believed divine. In a city where togas once symbolized reason and rhetoric, men now bowed before a boy in eyeliner. It would have been laughable if it hadn't been so real. The Senate of Rome, that ancient institution built by the blood and minds of centuries, had become an audience to Elagabalus's private theater. Their decrees were ignored, their voices drowned beneath flutes and drums of imported Syrian festivals. Once, the chamber debated the fate of nations. Now it debated whether the emperor's lover should be titled imperial consort or high priest of pleasure. But it got worse. One day the senators received a sealed package. They opened it expecting imperial orders. Instead they found dung, literal dung, carefully boxed, sent as a reply to one of their petitions. A joke? A warning? Or simply contempt made manifest? And still they remained. Some wrote letters begging for tradition. Others prayed that this madness would pass like a fever. But Elagabalus wasn't interested in tradition or healing. He was interested in performance. At his feasts, senators were seated randomly with beggars and actors. At ceremonies, they were made to wear women's robes, kiss sacred stones, and chant in a foreign tongue. And if one dared refuse, they were dismissed, shamed, replaced. Power, he made clear, belonged not to Rome's laws, but to his whims. Behind each act was not just cruelty, it was strategy. To Elagabalus, mocking the Senate was a way to sever the empire from its past. If the Senate was a stage, then he would rewrite the script. He, not Cicero. He, not Augustus. The past was ashes, the present, his playground. But mockery has a price. As Rome's dignity crumbled, its fury grew. Whispers passed through the corridors of power. Old families, once proud, now plotted in corners. The Praetorian Guard, too, began to murmur. The laughter that once filled his court began to sound like a countdown. Elagabalus believed that by chaining the Senate in absurdity, he was forging a new Rome. But what he forged instead was a rebellion, silent, simmering, and waiting for the moment when the jester would bleed like a king. And when that moment came, no senator wept, because by then they were no longer men of honor. They were survivors of a joke that had gone too far. Faith was his armor, or so he believed. Elagabalus did not rule with the sword, but with the sun, not with decrees, but with rituals. To him, Rome was not a city of marble and blood. It was a temple, a canvas for his divine performance. At dawn, he'd stand before the sacred black stone, arms lifted to the heavens, robes glittering like fire. He didn't pray like the others. He performed, as if every chant, every incense offering, was a rehearsal for immortality. He wasn't Rome's emperor. He was its god, but gods too can be feared. Behind temple curtains and golden altars, the empire trembled. The people of Rome no longer knew what to believe. Bread was scarce, military bonuses unpaid. Streets once filled with triumphal parades now echoed with foreign hymns and rumors of madness in the palace. And in every whispered prayer, Elagabalus was no longer the blessing, but the curse. The soldiers were the first to lose faith. Once protectors of the boy king, they now looked at his rituals with narrowed eyes. There were no victories under his reign, only feasts. No conquest, only lovers. No discipline, only chaos. Their oaths had been made to Rome, not to a sun god from the deserts of Syria. Fear, once his weapon, began to turn inward. Elagabalus knew something was changing. He tightened his circle, watched the shadows. He suspected his cousin, young, quiet Alexander Severus, of being the symbol his enemies needed. And he was right. What he didn't see coming was who would betray him. Julia Mesa, the grandmother who had placed the crown on his head, was also the one who plotted to take it off. She had watched the empire slip through his perfumed fingers, and she knew Rome would not survive another year of divine theater. Her solution was brutal, elegant, Roman. Replace the god with a mirror. A boy who looked like order, who spoke like tradition, who smiled like hope. The gods had spoken, but this time they spoke with daggers. On a cold March morning in 222, the Praetorian Guard struck. No grand rebellion, no dramatic last stand, just a hallway soaked in betrayal. Elagabalus was seized, his mother too. No ceremony, no trial, just silence, and then screams. The god bled. Dragged through the streets like a criminal, the once divine boy was stripped of his titles, his robes, and his mythology. His body, mutilated and spat upon, was tossed into the Tiber like garbage. No tomb, no prayer, no memory. But you cannot drown a story. Elagabalus's reign ended in disgrace, but his legend survived, half in horror, half in awe. Was he a madman? A prophet? A warning? Or simply a boy who mistook devotion for destiny? Whatever the answer, one truth remains. When faith becomes theater and fear becomes fuel, even gods must fall. Wind rattled the shutters of the imperial palace, pushing desert sand against marble imported from Greece. Somewhere in the maze of corridors, a 12-year-old boy recited Virgil beneath a single oil lamp. His name was Alexander Severus, though at that moment, while tutors drilled him on rhetoric, he was simply Bassianus, a quiet cousin no one in Rome had bothered to fear. Yet Julia Maesa watched him as a sculptor studies uncut stone. She saw in that shy posture what Rome was begging for. Discipline, modesty, a face that looked more like yesterday than tomorrow. Alexander would be the antidote to perfume-soaked nights and golden gowns. He would be order wearing a child's smile. And so the grandmother who once crowned a living sun god began knitting a new constellation in secret. She started with rumor. Subtle, almost tender gossip that drifted through the barracks. The cousin is studious. He prays like our fathers did. He tips the soldiers when no one is watching. Each whisper chipped away at the emperor's divinity. Next came the spectacle of adoption. Elagabalus, pressured by Maesa, cajoled by the Praetorian captains, agreed to name Alexander heir. In a sudden burst of generosity, he presented the boy to the Senate. The chamber erupted in manufactured applause. Senators bowed, grateful for a successor who spoke Latin without an accent of incense. To Rome, it felt like a sunrise after a long, fevered night. To Elagabalus, it felt like ice sliding beneath his skin. Within weeks, the emperor's paranoia bloomed. He ordered guards outside Alexander's study, but they reported only quiet prayers and scrolls scattered like fallen leaves. Still, the fear grew. In private, Elagabalus muttered that the boy's calm smile was really a knife. He withheld allowances, canceled audiences, surrounded himself with dancers and sycophants, people too dazzled to betray him, but betrayal had already found another stage. One humid evening, Alexander's tutor discovered poison in a pitcher of watered wine meant for the boy. No arrests were made. Culprits vanished into torch-lit corridors. The Praetorian Guard took the hint. They doubled Alexander's watch, and in doing so, halved their loyalty to Elagabalus. The emperor responded with the only language he trusted: spectacle. In a temple ceremony, he placed Alexander beside the black sunstone, forced the child to kneel while he towered above him in embroidered silk. Yet the crowd's gaze drifted not to the god who spoke, but to the boy who listened, gentle and still. Even humiliation could not dim that quiet light. It only revealed the cracks in Elagabalus's own. At night, Julius Soemius pleaded with her son, "Trust the family, trust your blood." But blood had already chosen sides, and Maesa, watching everything, kept her silence. Silence sharper than any sword. When the final move came, it unfolded like clockwork. The Praetorian Guard marched into the palace not as protectors, but as judges. They offered a bargain: step aside and live, or resist and fall. Elagabalus, sensing the tide he himself had stirred, clung to the altar and begged the sun to blind his enemies. Dawn answered with emptiness. Alexander Severus was proclaimed emperor in the very courtyard where rose petals once showered half-naked dancers. The crowds that gathered did not shout or weep. They exhaled, long, relieved, exhausted. Julia Maesa stood behind her new protege, hands resting softly on his shoulders, as if she had always meant to end here. Some say loyalty died that morning. Others say it was reborn. But all agreed on one thing. Rome did not hate gods or monsters. Rome hated instability. And when a boy in plain wool could promise calm, even angels scented with myrrh were expendable. Thus the last betrayal was sealed, not with poison or steel, but with adoption papers and a grandmother's quiet calculation. The sun god fell, the student rose, and the empire, for the moment, exhaled in the fragile peace between two heartbeats. Before sunrise on March 11th, 222, Rome's winter air tasted of iron. Inside the imperial palace, the corridors were hushed. No drums, no flute players, only the soft echo of sandals on marble as a squad of Praetorians advanced. They carried no torches. They already knew the way. Elagabalus, still barely 18, shared a small chamber with his mother that night. Perfume lingered on the pillows, scraps of golden fabric lay across a chair, waiting for the next performance. When the first door slammed, the emperor bolted upright. Somewhere down the hall, a soldier shouted an order, and steel clattered against steel. Julia Soamias gripped her son's wrist. "Stay calm," she whispered, though her own voice trembled. They tried to flee through a service stair, but another detachment blocked the exit. Cornered, they hid behind a heavy curtain beside the latrines, the scent of incense colliding with sewage, divinity suffocating in filth. The curtain ripped away. No trial, no proclamation, just blades flashing once, twice, until the white marble was freckled red. It took minutes, yet felt like ceremony. A darkened version of every sunlit ritual they had ever staged. When it was over, an officer wiped his sword on a fold of purple silk, then ordered the body stripped. The god was naked now. They dragged mother and son through the palace gates, feet banging against stone steps that had once been strewn with rose petals. Servants averted their eyes. A few crossed themselves with trembling fingers. Outside, dawn light revealed the Praetorian camp already buzzing. To prove the deed, the guards lifted Elagabalus's severed head and shouted, "Rome is free." But Rome demanded more than death. It demanded humiliation. The corpses were hauled to the forum, kicked, spat on, then yoked to a cart like refuse. Late rising citizens peeked from doorways, witnessing the fallen deity rattle across cobblestones. Children pointed, dogs barked, some laughed. Nervous, brittle laughter that sounded like relief. At the Tiber's edge, where beggars huddled for warmth, the guards completed the purge. They tied stones to the ankles of the once emperor and his mother, muttered a curse, and rolled the bodies into brown water. The river swallowed them without a splash, as if eager to erase the nightmare. Yet erasure had only begun. That afternoon, the Senate convened in rare unanimity. They pronounced damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. All statues of Elagabalus were to be melted, his name chiseled from inscriptions, his coins recalled and overstruck with the face of the new boy emperor, Alexander Severus. Masons hammered until marble faces shattered. Artists painted over frescoes. Even the golden plates used at his infamous banquets were resmelted into ordinary candlesticks, as if dull metal could dull remembrance. The Elagabalium itself was stripped. The sacred black stone, once hauled across deserts and propped atop senators' shoulders, was quietly removed and hidden in a warehouse outside the city. In its place rose a fresh altar to Jupiter, Rome's old father making a triumphant return. Incense of Syrian myrrh was replaced by the familiar scent of Roman laurel. Every trace of the young sun god was meant to vanish like smoke. But memory is stubborn. You can hammer a name from stone, yet still hear it whispered in alleys where torches dim. You can drown a body, yet legends flow. And so in taverns after midnight, soldiers still told stories of the emperor priest who wore earrings and demanded to be wife and goddess all at once. Mothers warned unruly children that the mad sun boy would steal their dreams. Philosophers debated whether his fall proved the wrath of Jupiter or the fragility of human delusion. Elagabalus had sought eternity through spectacle, believing devotion could bend reality. What he found instead was the river, the cold, blank page where Rome rewrites what it cannot bear to face. But under the city's marble skin, his pulse kept beating, faint yet irrepressible, reminding every ruler after him that splendor is never stronger than the crowd's patience. In the end, he achieved a different kind of immortality, not as a god adored, but as a cautionary shadow, haunting the very empire that tried to forget him. Centuries have passed since the black stone was carted out of Rome and the Tiber swallowed the body of its teenage god. Yet the question still lingers like incense in an abandoned temple. Who was Elagabalus? To the ancient chroniclers, Dio, Herodian, the anonymous pen behind the Historia Augusta, he was a libertine, a blasphemer, the boy who turned the imperial palace into a brothel and draped the empire in silks it never asked to wear. They wrote of rose-petal suffocations, oceans of perfume, and banquets so obscene that moral decay seemed to drip from the very walls. But read carefully and the ink smudges. Dio Cassius served the Senate Elagabalus mocked. Herodian craved stability the boy refused to give. Their hostility was personal, political, and perhaps exaggerated. After all, scandal is a potent shield. If you can paint a ruler insane, you never have to ask whether his fall served your own ambitions. Modern scholars sift the rubble with different tools. Numismatists note that the emperor's coins, though rare, bear no whisper of chaos, only standard titles and a calm, boyish profile. Archaeologists remind us that importing foreign gods was hardly scandalous in cosmopolitan Rome. Psychologists wonder whether Elagabalus's gender fluidity, shocking then, resonant now, was an earnest quest for identity in an age that granted none. So is he a monster, reveling in cruelty, or a martyr to authenticity, crushed by an empire terrified of anything it couldn't label? The answer, perhaps, is both, or neither. History rarely hands us neat verdicts. Look at the ruins of the Elagabalus. Jupiter's altar now stands where sun worship once burned. Yet beneath those stones, archaeologists still find fragments of Syrian mosaics. Tiny, brilliant tesserae no chisel could fully erase. Elagabalus is like that. Chip away the gossip and a few vivid shards remain. A boy priest forced onto the world's largest stage. A ruler who tried to fuse flesh, faith, and power. A soul so hungry for transcendence that he mistook his own heartbeat for the pulse of divinity. And Rome? Rome did what empires do. It buried the body, outlawed the name, rewrote the story, then borrowed pieces of it anyway. A century later, Emperor Aurelian would elevate another Eastern sun god, Sol Invictus, and no senate dared protest. By the time Constantine placed a radiant cross atop the empire, the line between heresy and orthodoxy had blurred beyond recognition. The road to Rome's Christian future, ironically, wound past the forgotten altar of a teenage self-styled goddess. Stand on that hill today and you'll feel neither incense nor hymns, only the hush of unresolved memory. Perhaps that is Elagabalus's true legacy, a mirror held up to every age, reflecting its anxieties about gender, faith, and the raw nerve of difference. A warning that power without restraint can corrode, yes, but also a whisper that conformity can kill the brightest flames before they fully burn. So, monster or martyr, you decide. But before you choose, ask yourself, if a 15-year-old rose today, claiming a divine calling that shattered every rule we know, would we condemn him as quickly as Rome did? Or would we pause long enough to wonder what truth might hide beneath the scandal? History is never only about the past. It is the conversation we keep having with ourselves. If this story stirred you, share the moment that struck hardest. And stay with us, because the empire's shadows are long, and just beyond them waits another tale of power, faith, and the fragile human heart.